I have finally conquered Malenia, Blade of Miquella, to round out the main bosses, allowing the completion of this video. When I originally began the Elden Ring ranking series, dividing videos by region seemed like the way to go, as Limgrave had 32 bosses of its own. As I played completely blind, I didn't realize how frequently bosses repeated throughout the game, meaning by the time you get to the last couple of regions, you aren't coming across enough new unique bosses for a rankings video, as many of the bosses would be essentially the same entries from the Limgrave, Liurnia, and Altus Plateau videos. Long story short, we are skipping straight to the main boss rankings, counting contests that yield a remembrance or a great enemy felled screen upon defeat. Today and tomorrow, we'll be streaming a new Game Plus community co-op run here on YouTube. Anyone is welcome, so feel free to join in the fun. Just to note, summoning bypasses New Game cycle, so you can leave your character in New Game and still participate. This run will be on the PS5, I believe PS4 can join as well. Without further ado, enjoy the Elden Ring main boss rankings and let me know who your favorite boss was in the comments below. Magma Vermicar. The challenge in making a video where bosses are ranked worst to best is trying to critique the first few entries without sounding too negative, but I don't think many will mention the name of this monstrosity in conversations about their favorite bosses in the game. The soundtrack is solid enough, but it's the Soldier of Godric theme reused for the 45th time, although in fairness, I don't expect every boss for a game of this scale to have a unique soundtrack. Aesthetically, I did wonder why he has wings but doesn't fly around the arena at all. The Magma Verm Scale Sword, which drops upon victory, does mention, it said these land-bound dragons were once human heroes who partook in Dragon Communion, a grave transgression for which they were cursed to crawl the earth upon their bellies, shadows of their former selves. Not inherently terrible by any means, I just expected something more substantial to guard the passage to the Altus Plateau. Fia's Champions. In the vein of the Crown of the Sunken King gank squad from Dark Souls 2, this is one of the weaker encounters in the game as you simply face off with a legion of spawned phantom NPCs. This was honestly so forgettable, I had to re-watch the footage to recall which individuals actually were Fia's champions. Interestingly, the item drop, Fia's Mist, says, this sorcery was developed to oppose the Round Table hold and is effective only against the Tarnished, which sounds more devious than Fia's character originally seems. Some argue perhaps her hugs are actually a sly way to siphon some life from the Tarnished. Also, interestingly, the received item from said hug, Baldakin's Blessing, lowers your max HP by 5% when kept in your inventory. Thickening the plot further, Fia has a line of dialogue saying, "My dear, have you ever heard of Black Knife Prince? Dear Rogier likes to talk of it when abed." This obviously opens further questions that expand beyond the scope of this video. The combat is your run-of-the-mill NPC mix, but this is a boss that's really meant to tell a story rather than provide top-notch combat. Mimic Tier. This character mirror fight is of course going to be specific for each player, but the concept still makes for a fresh, unique contest. The drawback is that once the interest of the concept subsides, the combat is weak, as you of course know the exact moveset that will be reciprocated. When you combine in that NPC fights are generally quite telegraphed and predictable to begin with, this is a benign contest but provides an opportunity to have some fun. I personally took the opportunity to get some Scarlet Rot going, as well as practice some parries. I believe the Mimic Tier also has fixed stats, as with any other boss, and doesn't scale to the player level. Not a ton to add about this one, just a bit of entertainment. Leonine Misbegotten and Misbegotten Warrior and Crucible Knight. It's difficult what to make of Leonine Misbegotten, as it's almost impossible for a lion with a sword to not be awesome, but it feels like he's missing a little something to push him into the realm of being truly fantastic. Perhaps it's his moveset, which isn't particularly unique, although still fun to engage in combat with. Interestingly, the word misbegotten actually means ill-conceived, poorly designed, or illegitimate, which does tie in with the grafted greatsword he doesn't use but drops, which says, "A revenger's weapon, it is burdened with oceans of anger and regret. A lone surviving champion from a country now vanished was so determined to continue fighting, he claimed the swords of an entire clan of warriors." Given the design of the weapon and clear allusion to Game of Thrones, given the George R.R. Martin connection, I've got to think there is some further link here. Maybe some of you big fans out there can fill me in below. While this version caps off one of my favorite dungeons in the game in Castle Morn, the encounter with a generic version of him and Crucible Knight in Caelid also drops the great enemy felt text. Not a ton to add to this version here, as I was so over-leveled by this point the fight never materialized to a 1 versus 2, but the Crucible Knights are some of the best mini-bosses in Elden Ring. Valiant Gargoyles, another evolution in the line of dual gargoyle fights from Man-Eaters and Demon Souls to the Bell Gargoyles in Dark Souls 1 and 2, and while not a boss, the gargoyle encounters in Dark Souls 3. The gargoyles have evolved and grown, specifically their legs over the years, which makes the combat a little awkward. These guys seem to be most similar to the Dark Souls 3 variety. Although I still like their design, I prefer the Dark Souls and Demon Souls character models, as it feels you're fighting the whole gargoyle rather than their legs, as the combat, at least for melee, can lean on you hacking away at their knees and ankles. That's not to say they don't look awesome, as they do, especially the Twin Blade version, who utilizes the War of Ash in devastating fashion. Speaking of the Great Sword and Twin Blade that are each dropped, mention, just like the wielder, the missing parts have been mended with corpse wax, patchwork of champions. Add in their poison and they're quite a tricky encounter. Perhaps not the most original, but it's also nice to have some amount of recurring friends in the series. Red Wolf of Ratagon. Maybe not the most original boss in the world, as many will probably mark him as Sif with magic, but I enjoyed the encounter quite a bit. The curved sword he utilizes casts an incantation rather than a physical sword, which is a slick little addition. He also casts a few spells and rounds out his arsenal with melee dash attacks. I know some players can have trouble with his frantic nature, but it's also surprising how little defense or health what seems like a prominent enemy in a legacy dungeon has. On the positive side, the aesthetic of a large red wolf with magic looks great along with a solid arena. The soundtrack isn't technically bad, it's just not very memorable. It's entirely possible I'm missing something in the vast wilderness of Elden Ring, but I can find next to no lore or backstory on him. No weapon drops or other characters even mentioning him. Was he Radagon's companion, similar to Artorias and Sif? Is this just inferred? If I'm just missing the information, please let me know what you know below. Dragon Kin Soldier of Nox. The sheer size and aesthetic of this ancient hollowed dragon can be pretty intimidating at first, especially upon entering this expansive, gorgeous arena in which you may expect the gargantuan skeleton to rise from his throne. However, once he falls from the heavens, he has a fairly telegraphed, labored melee moveset in Phase 1. Phase 2 is where this fight kicks into gear as the Dragon Kin Soldier rises into the air to throw ice lightning your way. It's not the most difficult attack to avoid, as you can simply outrun it, but it sure looks pretty sweet. The dropped frozen lightning spear informs us the Dragon Kin were born in the Eternal City, where they knew no true sky nor true lightning. Instead, ice lightning was their weapon. He's surely one of the coolest looking bosses in Elden Ring, with his 4-way wings and even a royal looking cape, which does make you wonder if a dragon put his cape on himself, or which beings were in control or possibly companions of the Dragon Kin Soldier of Nox. Sir Gideon Ofnir. Much in the mold of Gehrman of Bloodborne, Sir Gideon Ofnir is a hub-world arbiter of new information for the player who becomes an end-game boss. On one hand, the sheer variety of incantations and spells he casts creates a visual spectacle of magical fury. However, there doesn't seem to be much rhyme or reason to Sir Spamsalot's choice of casting. It suits his character as the all-knowing to have access to a large array of spells and incantations as well as infinite FP, but the combat would have been more interesting if he had specific mix-ups and more clever uses or reasoning for when and what he casts, rather than just an infinite flow that's seemingly random. I'd have to hear more arguments, but I almost want to say Mad Tongue Alberich is a better casting fight minus the lore, which Sir Gideon has plenty with his armor set reading, worn by Gideon Ofnir the All-Knowing. Knowledge begins with the recognition of one's ignorance, the realization that the search for knowledge is unending, but when Gideon glimpsed into the will of Queen Marika, he shuddered in fear. At the end, that should not be. A unique and visually fun, but probably unsurprising contest. Flying Dragon Agheel. While this majestic beast appears numerous times throughout the Lands Between in a handful of versions, I think you'll always remember your first, as his initial entrance as a free-roaming monster ignites the fun and possibilities that you're about to encounter on your epic journey. Fighting this dragon on the back of Torrent is a refreshing take on combat with beasts of this size and stature. While most were privy to this dragon due to his prevalence in trailers, this was one of the first times where I think it hit you that holy crap, I'm actually playing Elden Ring right now. Initially, I tried to combat him as though he was Midir, but quickly realized making use of Torrent was the way to go. His moveset is fairly limited, but he's just a sample of the epic adventure you're about to embark on. Godskin Apostle, Godskin Noble, and Godskin Duo. When I make these rankings, I often start with a quick rough draft of the list of bosses, basically a first instinct ranking, and move bosses up and down as I write and think more about them. I have to be honest, I still have no idea where to rank these guys, as I've moved these guys up and down the list multiple times and it never looked right. Truth be told, I try to rank bosses as fairly as I can based on their design quality, but there are a few I'm willing to die on a hill for over where they're placed on a video meant for entertainment. Walking back from that mini rant, I actually do really like the combat of these guys, especially the Godskin Apostle, as he wields the Godskin Peeler to perfection. We discussed them individually in the Altus Plateau Rankings video, so we should comment on their attempted replication of the famous Ornstein and Smo fight from Dark Souls. This probably isn't popular, but I honestly didn't have a problem with them being paired in Crumbling Farum Azula. It makes sense from a character perspective. It's an endgame area where the bosses should have a level of difficulty to them, and if you are struggling solo, there is always a Spirit Ash or Summon to balance them out. Should this boss have been someone new rather than a repeat? Well, I could buy that. Regal Ancestor Spirit. I know I tend to use the word majestic frequently, but if there was ever a time for it, holy crap, is this fight majestic as fuck. A fight that's much more about ambiance and artistry than combat, as breathtaking is what comes to mind when describing the atmosphere of this encounter. A delicate, spiritually imbibed arena and stunning, soothing soundtrack create one of the best atmospheres in the game. The remembrance earned reads, ancestral spirits exist as a phenomenon beyond the purview of the air tree. Life sprouts from death as it does from birth. Such is the way of the living. I especially love this contest, as being a massive fan of Red Dead Redemption 2, this honestly felt like something Arthur Morgan would see in a vision. The combat won't blow you away, but I think the fight is purposely toned down to allow the player to take in the artistry of the contest. If the action was fast and furious, you wouldn't have the chance to let this delightful encounter sink in as thoroughly. Astel, Natural Born of the Void. From what I can tell, Astel has been getting rave reviews as a boss, but I personally didn't enjoy the fight to a great extent, so this placement is likely going to be lower than most would like. I will meet you halfway though and acknowledge the purple glow and space theme in accompaniment of Astel's aesthetic and moveset is beautiful. Maybe not his face per se, but everything else anyways. I will admit as well that I think Astel will grow on me upon further encounters when I gain a better grasp of his moveset and how to properly combat him, as he does offer a very well balanced combination of ranged spells and melee with his tail, as well as close quarters melee grab attacks and AoE casts as well. The Remembrance of the Natural Born says, a malformed star born in the flightless void far away, once destroyed an eternal city and took away their sky, a falling star of ill omen. Come to think of it, as someone who's a baby around bugs, I think his dragonfly and spider-like aesthetic are just creepy as shit to me, although I see why others would love this design. How's that for top-notch technical analysis? Elemer of the Briar. I still question a bit why certain bosses were placed where they were. Elemer of the Briar is one of the slickest, toughest dudes in the game and would make for a fantastic first-time encounter, so I question why you run into generic versions of him elsewhere before the namesake encounter. It's a small nitpick, but usually the generic versions show up after the main named boss's contest. Maybe the thinking was most players wouldn't come across a boss that only appears in a specific location at a specific time, and the reward for having found those versions would have been the practice of fighting him previously. It's just strange to me that you'd diminish the freshness and uniqueness of such a great boss by having him appear randomly elsewhere first, unless the main version had a significant evolution in his combat. These are very minor critiques, however, as I mentioned how fantastic this enemy is in the Limgrave video. The Morace Executioner Sword mentions, Elemer of the Briar, the bell-bearing hunter snatched the sword from the site of his looming execution and furnished it with battle skills from his home of Eocade. Come to think of it, maybe in lore the other bell-bearing hunters are just clones of Elemer. Either way, some of the best humanoid combat in the game matches one of the most badass looking enemies in the game. Commander Nile. I think the combat itself will be hit or miss with a lot of you here, but he has a pretty cool backstory, as the veteran's prostheses he drops says, bladed prosthetic leg and wreathed with the power of lightning instead attached to the fist. Commander Nile, veteran of Castle Sol, offered this prostheses in exchange for the lives of defeated knights held prisoner. He went on to lead these men as an army of no nation. I, for one, really enjoyed the uniqueness of this encounter. Yes, the 2 summons he has at the beginning won't be most players' favorite part of the match, and it isn't mine for that matter either, but at least they don't respawn, and they do match the aforementioned backstory in leading an army of imprisoned knights. The use of electric shock via his prosthetic leg is one of the more clever and creative boss attacks in the game, as well as the massive blizzards he whips up with his staff. It can be quite tricky getting the hang of where safety lies in avoiding his moveset, but it's a refreshing challenge from the typical humanoid boss. He has one of the best arenas in the game as well, taking place in the crumbling Castle Sol covered in snow with the Erd Tree prominently displayed in the background. Not to mention, how about that epic soundtrack? Godfrey, First Elden Lord, the Golden Shade. A prelude for the semi-main event in the endgame in the capital of Ash, Godfrey, First Elden Lord, the Golden Shade edition is still a pretty fun fight in the lead up to Morgat the Omen King. His golden phantom form looks fantastic, and maybe I just like old buildings with overgrown vegetation, but his arena is one of the best in the game, as well as the excellent soundtrack that accompanies the fight. The combat is essentially a nerfed version of the real encounter later, but being a prelude to the very difficult Morga, it would have been overkill to put an overly tough encounter here as well. Remember, the best games have an ebb and flow to them. Even with the difficulty of Souls games, the curve has waves to it. It's not a diagonal line up to the right. There's a good reason for bosses like Fia's Champions and Mimic Tyr. For this point in the game, he still takes some beating, as you must navigate quite a bit of varied timing on his axe attacks as well as earth stomps, which can be tricky to get used to. Fire Giants. This monstrosity seems to have a bit of a split opinion in the community. I imagine rankings for this guy will be all over the place. My critique mostly lies in Phase 2, which I believe is a massive missed opportunity. The revelation of the face and third eye on this gargantuan's midsection as he rips his leg clean off is one of the most badass mid-fight cutscenes you'll see. The problem is, there's no mechanic as far as I know that pertains to the eye itself. When shown the cutscene, I thought, okay, obviously the eye is the weak spot, as how prominently it is displayed and how intuitive it is to believe this would be an area to attack to bring down the giant for a critical riposte. This should be a neat puzzle to solve. However, you end up just wailing away on his legs some more for minimal damage while trying not to be set ablaze. Like I always say, I'll take a boss that's new and unique over a boss that's generic any day, and Phase 2 does present a new challenge. To fill in some lore, his remembrance reads, "The Fire Giant is a survivor of the war against the giants. Upon realizing the flames of their forge would never die, Queen Marika marked him with a curse. O trifling giant, mayest thou tend thy flame for eternity." Loretta, Knight of the Haligtree. The culmination of the Tree Sentinel lineage you fight your way through as you traverse the lands between. FromSoftware truly did a fantastic job with the spectacular design of the Tree Sentinels, as with the original in Limgrave. Loretta's armor, weapon, shield, and casting, along with her trusty steed's matching set, looks amazing. Even having heard it countless times at this point, her thunderous soundtrack is one of my favorites in the game and will stand out as one of the more recognizable as Elden Ring ages. Though Loretta's mastery spell lets us in on some backstory, mentioning, developed by Loretta after her long, bloody journey to seek out a place where the Albinorics could live in peace, and her war sickle originally given for service as a personal guard to Carian royalty, the weapon's blue glintstone has been replaced with unalloyed gold. The combat isn't too dissimilar from the other Tree Sentinels, with her use of the Ash of War on the sickle being a standout maneuver, plus the obvious aforementioned use of various magic spells. Margat the Fel Omen. The first wall in my original playthrough, Margat was a stark reminder that I am indeed playing a Souls game, as well as a sure indicator that I should explore elsewhere before embarking on Stormveil Castle. The footage shown here is from my second run when I was pretty overleveled from taking out every mini-boss in Limgrave prior to engaging in this fight, but the stubbornness of my underleveled first character is what ironically made me appreciate the mechanics and design of this fight. As much as I'll argue for the inclusion of puzzle and gimmick bosses, encounters like Margat are still my personal favorite. Bosses that are action-oriented, but ones in which you must understand and master their patterns. Sprinting forward and mashing buttons for victory is simply not an option. You must read when to play defense, whether it's roll dodging, staying out of range, or blocking with a shield, and when to get in and attack, which becomes even more paramount upon the use of an incantational great hammer and sword in Phase 2. Check out my Limgrave video for a further breakdown of one of my favorite early game bosses in Margat the Fel Omen. Godric the Grafted. I might be a little biased on this placement, as Godric the Grafted is one of my favorite bosses in Elden Ring. One of the best soundtracks in the game, as it is one that is truly memorable that I can place immediately upon hearing. I still maintain the mid-fight cutscene is one of the most badass things I've seen a boss do in a video game, chopping off his own arm and infusing it with a dragon head that ignites fire in one last desperate attempt to stave off defeat. Not to mention the excellent foreshadowing of the opening scene, as well as with Godric consoling the deceased dragon as well. He wields a good variety of melee-based attacks with his axes in Phase 1, some whirlwinds to avoid, as well as massive earthquake maneuvers. As I had previously ranked Godric as the best boss in Limgrave, there isn't a ton to add here that I didn't mention in that video, so I'll mention his remembrance, which states, "A feeble man sought power through the grotesque act of crafting. One day we'll return together to our home, bathed in rays of gold, with his axe simply stating, 'I command thee, kneel, for I am the lord of all that is golden.'" Lich Dragon Fortisax and Ancient Dragon Lanciax. Surely one of the best looking fights in Elden Ring, as the red lightning imbuing her black scaled body looks fantastic. This aesthetic matches with the purple and black background of the arena, creating a haunting atmosphere for battle. It's an excellent fight as you maneuver your way through diving dragon melee attacks, double-fisted red lightning, and even some Deathblight dragon breath. It's an excellent fight, but doesn't touch the heights of Midir, but then again, what does? Victory over Fortisax culminates Fia's quest line, unlocking the Age of Duskborn ending. Her remembrance reads, "After Godwyn, the Golden, became the Prince of Death, the ancient dragon fought long and hard against the death within its companion. Alas, victory was never achieved, and its only reward was corruption." I should also quickly mention Ancient Dragon Lanciax, who we meet in the Altus Plateau, whose glaive actually indicates Lanciax was a sister of Fortisax. It is said that she took the form of a human to commune with the knights as a priestess of the ancient dragon cult. She drops the great enemy Feld text, and her fight lies somewhere between Flying Dragon Akil and her sister Fortisax. Star Scourge Radon. Just a note, my encounter with Radon took place before the last patch, in which I hear he was nerfed to an extent, so I'm curious to see how different he is in my next run. Given the nature of this battle, I have a feeling he's gonna be all over the map, with some of you placing him as the best boss in the game, and some absolutely detesting the contest. I fall somewhere in the middle. As an event, this is one of the more memorable parts of Elden Ring. However, some of the combat can feel a little bit frantic and awkward given the sheer size and movement of Radon. The idea of summoning an army of NPC friends to take out this gigantic foe was a ton of fun, and I actually laughed out loud when Patches returned home after taking one attack. As you do summon your buddies towards this hulking figure in the distance, dodging his massive great arrows as you try and close the distance, you really feel like you're charging across a historic battlefield to take on a legendary foe. I'll try to solo him in a future run, but even with the army of friends, avoiding his great curved swords and gravitational attacks wheeling around on his poor steed took some doing. His great rune says Radon was amongst the children of Rennala and Radagon, who became demigod stepchildren after Radagon's union with Queen Marika. The great rune burns to resist the encroachment of the Scarlet Rot. As well as his remembrance continuing, the Red Lion General wielded gravitational powers which he learned in Celia during his younger days, all so he would never have to abandon his beloved but scrawny steed. God-devouring serpent / Rykard, Lord of Blasphemy. It seems there's a bit of split opinion on Rykard, but I personally found this encounter to be one of the best in Elden Ring. As I mentioned in my Altus Plateau rankings video, I was completely blown away by this battle and absolutely loved the evolution of the Storm Ruler fight. For me, the combat was smooth and engaging, where the contest felt like a back and forth battle, as opposed to Storm King, which I still love, where there can be a lot of waiting around. Yorm, who is also a phenomenal boss, has better combat than Storm King, but Rykard expanded on the layers of the fight quite a bit, with the Serpent Hunter now having a distinct light and heavy attack, as well as an Ash of War. Phase 2 is when the spectacle really kicks into gear following another fantastic cutscene, of which there are quite a few in Elden Ring. Lore-wise, the Great Rune lets us in that Rykard was amongst the children of Rennala and Radagon, who became demigod stepchildren after Radagon's union with Queen Marika. But Rykard fed himself to the blasphemous serpent, Great Rune and all. With the remembrance continuing, Rykard took the form of a giant serpent that he might devour, grow, and live eternally. I understand the road of blasphemy is long and perilous. One cannot walk it unprepared to sin. Rennala, Queen of the Full Moon. For those of you that checked out my Liurnia rankings video, it's no secret how much I loved this boss, as Phase 2 is one of the most memorable, awe-inspiring sequences in the game. I'll be interested to see everyone's opinion to see if I'm in the minority, but I thought this was about as good as a casting boss can be, especially in the early game. Phase 1, which is essentially a mashup of Deacons of the Deep from Dark Souls 3 and Fool's Idol from Demon's Souls, isn't going to be everyone's cup of tea, but I'd argue is still pertinent for story purposes with her Great Rune reading. In her youth, Rennala was a prominent champion who charmed the Academy with her lunar magic becoming its master. She also led the Glintstone Knights and established the House of Caria as royalty, with her remembrance further filling us in. Children born anew by Rennala are all frail and short-lived, imperfect beings each and all. As the fight transitions into a moonlit lake, we truly see one of the most stunning arenas in the game as we do combat with an extremely well-balanced casting boss. Counter to the incessant spamming of Sir Gideon Ofnir, there is much more ebb and flow, rhyme and reason to the casting of Rennala. While the fight isn't the most difficult, this is about as beautiful and balanced as a casting boss will be. Yes, Dark Lurker is amazing as well, Dark Souls 2 fans out there. Moog, Lord of Blood. This is a tough one to rank, as although he wasn't one of my personal favorites, I know he's one of the best bosses in the game for many of you. He's even one of 2 bosses, along with Loretta, I just said fuck it to and used the Mimic tier to progress the game. Don't get too comfortable though, Moog. I'll be back for my revenge on you soon. I will admit, his character design aesthetically is phenomenal, as it suits who he's supposed to be perfectly, especially against the backdrop of the Mohgwyn Dynasty Mausoleum as the Lord of Blood. Moog's Great Rune mentions Moog and Morgat are twin brothers, and their Great Runes are naturally similar, but Moog's rune is soaked in accursed blood from his devout love for the wretched mire that he was born into far below the earth. The remembrance continues. Wishing to raise Miquella to full godhood, Moog wished to become his consort, taking the role of monarch, but no matter how much of his bloody bedchamber he tried to share, he received no response from the young Empyrean. We discussed the combat of Phase 1 in the Altus Plateau rankings video, but Phase 2 is where this contest really goes to another level, with Moog's classic Nihil attack as he thrusts his great spear into the air, sapping your HP to add to his own, sprouts a pair of wings, and splatters blood all over the arena floor. This phase is extremely difficult to navigate as you avoid the bleed status effect coming from all angles as well as his incoming melee. A fantastic addition to the world of Elden Ring. Morgat the Omen King. The Great Rune of Morgot confirms that the Omen King was born of the golden lineage and that he was indeed the Lord of Lendale, as well as the remembrance continuing. Though born one of the graceless Omen, Morgot took it upon himself to become the Erdtree's protector. He loved not in return, for he was never loved, but nevertheless love it he did. Combat-wise, Morgot has a huge variety of tricks up his sleeve as he utilizes his curved sword, raining incantation swords, incantation throwing knives, and an offhand incantational sword as well. He even produces a spear as well as a devastating blood attack if caught in Phase 2. I actually found his pace and variety quite tough to decipher, but in fairness was using a weapon that had no scaling at the time of playing. In my opinion, this was some of the more tricky, intricate combat in the game, especially for a melee character. From what I understand, Morga was Margat, and that version essentially sits at the base of Stormvale Castle to scope out if Tarnished is going to be a problem. It's a highlight to reach his arena as you finally step up upon the base of the enormous Erd Tree you've been looking at the entire game. A fantastic entry in the catalog of Elden Ring bosses. Beast Clergyman / Malekith the Black Blade. Just the name alone, Malekith the Black Blade, sounds cool as shit right off the bat, matched with his slick black armor with gold trim, contrasted magnificently with his red slicing blade and stunning arena where it feels that time stands still, as well as some of the best action combat in the game make this a boss encounter to remember. The remembrance of the Black Blade, Malekith was a shadow-bound beast given to his Empyrean. Marika's sole need of her shadow was a vessel to lock away destined death. Even then, she betrayed him. If I had a small critique, I would have scaled back his damage a touch in Phase 2, however increased his damage absorption to lengthen the encounter of this part of the fight. I admit this is complete nitpicking, and the design was probably implemented in this manner to keep the action fast and furious, and that is as the player must be ultra careful of Malekith's special ability of an extra health drainage infliction as he athletically leaps around the arena. This is all without even touching on Phase 1, which isn't half bad itself as you maneuver around a number of rock-based throwing attacks and sword slashes. Another small critique I'd have is that the soundtrack is pretty forgettable and tame. While a lofty standard, I would have expected something more akin to the OST of Lawrence or Cleric Beast from Bloodborne. Hauntingly, Malekith's Black Blade says, after a fragment of death was stolen on that fateful night, Malekith bound the blade with his own flesh, such that none might ever rob death again. How badass is that? Dragon Lord Placidusax. I considered including Placidusax with Fortisax and Lanciax, but thought there was enough for a unique entry and didn't want to lump them all together simply because they're all dragons, as I think this is a standout fight in the game for many of you, as it was for me. I would have struggled much more with this beast had it not been the last boss I fought in Elden Ring, as I was on rune level 150 when I came across him. Taking place in a secret location in one of the coolest areas of the game in crumbling Farum Azula. The highlight of the combat for me is Placidusax vanishing and streaking through the sky as cloudy lightning bursts with red sparks preparing for attack. The other memorable attack is his insane golden hyper beam that waves all over the arena floor. The remembrance says the Dragon Lord whose seat lies at the heart of the storm beyond time is said to have been Elden Lord in the age before the Erd Tree. Once his god was fled, the Lord continued to await its return. While there are quite a few dragons in Elden Ring, Dragon Lord Placidusax is my choice for the best dragon fight in the game. Godfrey, first Elden Lord / Hoaraloo Warrior. Surely one of the most difficult and satisfying bosses to defeat in the game, especially Hoaraloo Phase 2, which has a variety of offbeat attacks and grabs with timings that are very difficult to come to grips with, as it feels like you've been transported into Street Fighter or Tekken. That being said, the combination of both phases is some of the best pure action combat in Elden Ring. Phase 1 is extremely similar to the Golden Shade fight up until a foot stomp that takes extreme patience to wait out, where he becomes even more aggressive and has some AoE attacks that require god-tier timing to avoid or simply running as fast as possible on sight. Another outstandingly gangster cutscene ensues as Godfrey combines power with his lion companion and simply utters, "I've given thee courtesy enough, now I fight as Hoaraloo Warrior." What an absolute legend and badass. We can fill in some lore by noting the remembrance that informs us when Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, was robbed of his grace, becoming tarnished, he took with him his kinfolk and left the lands between. After the long march of the tarnished came to an end, Godfrey divested himself of kingship, becoming a simple warrior once more. Malenia, Blade of Mikola. I've been contemplating the thought of Malenia as the best boss FromSoftware has ever earthed, but am pulled back by a couple of flaws and controversial mechanics. I can't recall a time of feeling more like a badass than the first time I flawlessly dodged the devastating fight-ending nuke of Waterfowl Dance. I have no problem with an attack of this magnitude, as Malenia is billed as the undefeated swordswoman and is clearly designed to be one of the hardest bosses in the series. Where I will concede and critique this attack is on the timing of use. If the player is expected to master pinpoint timing to defeat arguably the most difficult boss in the series, that's one thing. However, when she immediately rises while you're directly underneath her, there isn't a whole lot you can do, and it often feels unfair, especially on occasions where she's standing around waiting for the player to attack and insta-dodges into the move. This isn't a good use of this brilliant maneuver. This ties into my second critique of there being a touch too much waiting around for her to do something, as she'll often dodge on direct input of an attack. This makes the flow of combat feel a bit unnatural and awkward at times. Lastly, I often see the argument that it's possible to avoid and dodge all of this as long as you get good. It's a shallow and short-sighted argument to give as a pass to any design as long as you get to the point of avoiding damage. Every boss in the series can be no hit. That doesn't mean they all have outstanding design. My friend Blackhawk had told me trying to beat Malenia is like trying to beat Orphan of Cause on Blood Level 4, and it truly felt that way. I'm not a no-hit runner by any means, but I can essentially no-hit Phase 1 at this point. Let's not get too crazy, Phase 2 would take a lot more work. As previously mentioned, there are multiple outstanding cutscenes in Elden Ring, and Malenia's might be the best of them all. Phase 2 amps up even further, maintaining a majority of Phase 1's moveset while adding in a number of AoE blasts, including the gorgeous Scarlet Aeonia. Just to fill in some quick lore, Malenia's Great Rune says, Malenia is daughter of Queen Margat and Radagon, and her Great Rune should have been the most sacred of all, with her remembrance continuing. Mikola and Malenia are both the children of a single god. As such, they are both Empyreans, but suffered afflictions from birth. One was cursed with eternal childhood, and the other harbored rot within. Upon defeating the undefeated swordswoman, I felt like I had truly reached my final form as a Souls player. Radagon of the Golden Order / Eldon Beast. Am I married to the combination of Radagon and Eldon Beast being number one on this list? Absolutely fucking not. I could have easily slotted in Malenia, Godfrey and Horaloo, or maybe some of you even had Radagon, Morgot, or Dragon Lord Placidusax. Sometimes it takes time for a game to marinate and settle, as well as multiple playthroughs with different builds, and even then, there will always be some level or opinion and debate to be had. I will say, having written, voiced, and edited this video, it's really hit me. Wow, there are a lot of really damn good bosses in this game. We haven't even seen possible DLC yet, which has often spawned what ends up being the best bosses in their respective games, with Artorias, Fume Knight, Gale, Midir, Sister Fried, Lady Maria, and Ludwig, just to name a few. Throughout the series, there have been a pretty varied variety of final bosses. While he can actually be defeated mid-game if you really wanted, I think most people consider Old King Allant the de facto final boss of Demon Souls, Gwyn, Lord of Cinder in Dark Souls, Nashandra plus Aldia and the Throne Watcher and Defender depending on your playthrough in Dark Souls 2, Soul of Cinder in Dark Souls 3, Gehrman, Moon Presence, or Murgo's Wet Nurse depending on your choices in Bloodborne, and either version of Ishin with the lovely Emma the Gentle Blade based on your path in Sekiro. Radagon of the Golden Order feels like the perfect balance and challenge with a combination of melee and magic offense. While in previous games we thought of a melee-specific build or a casting-specific build, Elden Ring feels like it really pushes a combination of the two, even though, as you can see, I stubbornly played the entire game melee on my first run. Phase 1 is a meticulous balance of avoiding Radagon's strikes of Marika's hammer, and his variety of casting holy damage and lightning requiring pinpoint timing of defense and attack. Whereas a number of Elden Ring bosses feel as though you're simply waiting for them to be done in order for it to be your turn. Radagon has a natural ebb and flow in his battle that feels more fluid. Once the teleportation and aggression kicks in at about half health is where your skills developed in the lands between must really take shape, as you must avoid the remnants of his teleportation and full gamut of AoE and melee attacks. His defeat segues beautifully into the majestic Eldon Beast, who is no victory lap boss as he takes some beating in his own right. Does some of the casting offense last an eternity? Absolutely. However, should one of the most magical beings in the game not have devastating magic? This doesn't make the attack inherently good, but on the other hand, the final boss of a world as challenging and expansive as Elden Ring should be something worth overcoming. Just an absolutely majestic ending reminiscent of the Divine Dragon of Sekiro. I would critique the chasing around the arena of Eldon Beast certainly hinders and slows the fight. The lore here is a video in itself, but we'll note the Eldon Beast remembrance simply states it was the vassal beast of the greater will and living incarnation of the concept of order. As with so many before, the introduction to set the table as you pass through the golden light and view the cutscene as well as the Eldon Beast transition is just fabulously done. I absolutely love that Radagon's theme is the main title cards as well. This was a really fantastic touch as it's one of the best tracks in the game. Like I said, I won't fight you on it and I may change my mind myself, but for now, Radagon of the Golden Order and the Eldon Beast is my pick for the best boss in Elden Ring. Anyone here is free to join the community New Game Plus run that will probably start a couple hours after this video drops. I hope you guys enjoyed it, have an awesome day, and see you soon.
Farewell, good hunter. May you find your worth in the waking world.